Wrapping things up here on a crossover Thursday edition of Locked On Ravens and Locked On Bucks. And this crossover Thursday is presented by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/Locked On NFL. Use code Locked On NFL, all lowercase, to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Kevin, we have talked a lot about what the Bucks have to offer, what the Ravens have to offer, some of the shortcomings. What are the three things that Baltimore needs to do on Monday night in order to come away with their fifth straight win and really start to put a stranglehold on the AFC as a whole?
Yeah, it's been quite the turnaround for Baltimore since that 0-2 start. But I think the first thing that the Ravens have to do in this game, I would love it if they were to get off to a fast start against this Tampa team. Like you said, I expect a lot of points in this game both ways. And if the Ravens can get out to a 10-0, 14-3, let's just say something along those lines type of lead, that will let them play defense more freely. Maybe Tampa will have to abandon the run game at that point. We'll see, how that goes for them. But for the Ravens, they have proven that they can, playing with a lead in the fourth quarter gets a little bit dicey for them, at least over the course of this season. But at least for the first three quarters, they play with a lead pretty well. And then we've also seen, for example, that game against Cincinnati and even the game against Kansas City where they had to come from behind and were just a toe away from beating or tying Kansas City in that game. They've been able to come back in some of these games, but it does not hurt to have a fast start. And I think you can establish momentum in that game. And sometimes when you do that, a la what happened against Buffalo for Baltimore in week 4, Derrick Henry opens that up with an 87-yard touchdown. Sometimes you just don't look back after you were able to do that. I also think for the Ravens defensively, kind of like what we talked about in the first couple segments, Baltimore has to be able to shut down or at least slow down Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. I don't think you're going to completely shut both guys down. They're going to get something somewhere with those guys. They're too talented not to. But if those guys are beating you over and over again, it opens up everything for Tampa Bay. I think they'll be able to run the football more effectively. Other targets will be able to get more because then you have to start shadowing guys over to those two players. So just like we've seen for the Ravens this season, star receivers will get theirs in some way, shape, or form. But can you limit it enough to where it doesn't feel as big of a threat and you feel comfortable maybe with some one-on-one coverages, maybe with just a little shadow here and there? If you have to start doubling guys or moving guys into that zone, Tampa could be able to feast off of that, especially with how Baker is slinging this football around. And then finally, just mistake-free football. One of the things that a lot of people have echoed this year in Baltimore is the Ravens' biggest opponent is themselves. They've beaten themselves in multiple times, almost lost games because of penalties or poor decision-making. John Harbaugh has been under fire a couple of times. And actually, I don't know if you saw James Mad Dog went on ESPN yesterday and was said, Tony Romo called him a top 10 coach on the CBS broadcast of all time. And Mad Dog was like, Harbaugh must have taken Romo out for dinner. Like that's ridiculous. Like all this stuff. He said Jeff Saturday was a better coach and was just
Jeez.
Going off on that. But Harbaugh's been awesome during his time in Baltimore. The issue with him over the last 5 or so years has been some of that decision making and some of the game awareness, where we know Harbaugh's record, but it was a pretty clean game from John Harbaugh in week 6, where first 5 weeks there was always something to talk about. If he can put together another clean game, no poor decisions, and that's all the coaching staff, not just Harbaugh, but coaching staff, players, everybody plays a clean game. I think that gives the Ravens the best shot to win because you are not just hurting yourself over and over in those situations.
Yeah, and on the Bucs side of things, look, they got to clog up those run lanes. They got to expose the secondary. And for the love of all things holy, protect Baker Mayfield. Look, clogging up the run lanes, Vita Vea, Kalijah Cansey, Logan Hall, Levante David, KJ Britt, those guys have to be on top of things in this one. They have to stop Derrick Henry immediately before he gets to the second level. If Henry gets past that defensive line with a head of steam, those Bucs defensive backs are going to have a really, really bad night. Henry is going to bounce off of them like a grown man playing football against a peewee team. The Bucs defensive line is very different when they had Vita Vea and Kalijah Cansey together. That became evident down the stretch last week against the New Orleans Saints, but it's a lot easier said than done to stop someone like Henry, but the Bucs absolutely cannot afford to let him dictate this game. As far as exposing the secondary, you talked about it. I've talked about it. It's no secret that the Ravens secondary outside of Marlon Humphrey this season has struggled a little bit. And that's real handy for a Bucs team that has Mike Evans that can get huge chunks in a hurry on the outside. Humphrey is going to have his hands full if he's lining up with Chris Godwin out of the slot, the league's leader in receptions, touchdowns, yards after catch, but he might be the only slot corner on the Buccaneers schedule that can actually slow Godwin down. So the issue there is if he's going to slow Godwin down, now Jalen McMillan has to step up. Sterling Shepard has to step up. Mike Evans has to be the first ballot Hall of Famer that he is and expose some of those weaknesses in the secondary in order to make sure that this Bucs offense can stay on the field, extend drives that end in scores, really chew up a lot of clock and be able to control things. And then, of course, speaking of Baker Mayfield, you have to keep him upright and so that he can find those guys down the field. There are some really good pass rushers on the Ravens defense, and the Bucs' entire starting offensive line has not been together since week 1 against the Commanders. Rookie center Graham Barton. I almost said Garrett Bowles. Rookie center Graham Barton was out last week with a hamstring issue. Again, we don't know if he's going to be available for this one. Hopefully he is, but Robert Hainsey played really well in his absence. But they have to protect Baker, allow those wide receivers to get through their routes and create those mismatches, allow that stuff to develop so that Baker can keep doing what he's done all year. If Mayfield has to start bailing and taking off to run, he does a pretty good job of sliding. But you and I both know the competitor that Baker is, and a couple of times he's going to lower that shoulder and he's going to try to fight for those extra yards. Don't even let him do it. Give him the clean pocket to work with. Let him pick apart a sometimes susceptible Ravens secondary. But Kevin, we're in for an exciting one, man. This is going to be a really, really fun game to watch. I'm glad it's in prime time. I'm glad these two teams are going to be under the big spotlight, especially with the way that Lamar and Baker have been playing this year.
Yeah, I'm pumped. I mean, and Lamar and Baker obviously have a history going back to both being drafted. Baker first overall, Lamar last pick of the first round in 2018. Both the guys have so much respect for each other. There are so many cool stories and everything. And then Baker honestly had a couple of fiery lines that people here in Baltimore still reference from back in the day. But it's cool to see those two every time they step on the field together. And while they're not going to be facing off one-on-one, Baker's not going to be trying to tackle Lamar out there. The quarterback
that would be ugly.
Yeah, I don't know how that would go. I think I'd probably pick the Ravens if that were the case, but going to be a good game regardless.
Yeah, 100%. And just so that your listeners and viewers know, Baker's a little bit different of a guy than he was back in those Browns days. So maybe don't hold it against him too much, things that he said back then, but I digress.